Once upon a time, the fastest way to get anywhere was on a horse. Then we ditched hay for horsepower, saddles for steering wheels, and now our cars seem to have more brains than some drivers. Hi, I'm Amanda Walsh, and welcome to RAC's Horizons podcast, From Hooves to Horseless Carriages and Cars to Computers on Wheels. Well, there's no doubt about it, the way we move has come a long way. In the early 1900s, cars sparked curiosity, excitement, and plenty of scepticism. Today, electric and driverless vehicles are doing the same, even though electric cars have been around a lot longer than you may think. To explore this evolution, I'm joined by Graeme Cocks. Graeme is an award-winning motoring historian, author, and former CEO of the Fremantle and York Motor Museums, and he's renowned for his contributions to automotive history. Welcome, Graeme. So let's just set the scene. It's the turn of the century and the horse and cart ruled the streets. And then out of nowhere, we have this noisy metal box on wheels, like something from another world. So just take us back to the year that the first car arrived in Perth.
Well, the first car overall was made in 1886 by Carl Benz. But it wasn't until 1896 that a car arrived in Fremantle on the wharf in a box. And it was a Leon Ballet Voiturette owned by a guy called Anatoly Bazhili. And he was a Ukrainian-Russian Jew. He imported this car. He worked in Paris. The car arrived. They didn't get it going in Fremantle. They took it on the train up to Perth, and then they had to get it going. And just people who arrived in St George's Terrace just to look at this thing. Because if you go back to that time, 1896, the idea of the car was in newspapers as some incredible thing from Paris, some strange object, these strange technology, the Ballet Perquis in Paris. And so we were the last outpost of the empire here. Well, we still were the empire until 1900, I guess.
Yeah.
And this thing was weird. The person sat in the front, the passenger sat in the front. It was three wheels. The driver sat behind. It had ignition with a flame, a hot tube ignition. Nobody really knew how to drive it except Anatoly himself. Nobody else had ever seen one. And a crowd gathered to watch this thing rumble up and down the street. And you can imagine everybody in Perth had horses or horse and carriage. If you were really poor and you didn't have a horse, you had to take the train. That was the scene for the arrival of the first car.
And it must have been so strange for the pioneers. It must have been almost like, a UFO had landed, just in terms of something they had never seen before.
An interesting thing about Western Australia is we have a big uptake of technology. So the mining industry in those days, 1890s was the gold mining boom. The gold mining industry had steam power. It had the start of electric power in Western Australia. But the internal combustion engine was just some space age idea from Europe that Otto had. And you look at that, 1892 was the first electric lighting in Perth. So really, we didn't even have a power station. We didn't have reticulated power to houses or to businesses. And all of that was starting to get going. And yet there was this guy with this machine that didn't need a horse to pull it. It didn't need a cable to run it. It didn't need anything except some liquid poured into it, and it would sort of go.
So all of these people obviously lined the streets back then, but what about when they rolled up to the town?
Well, they had no chance. You couldn't go overland. The roads in Western Australia were terrible. There were two ruts as tracks, because you didn't have anything down the middle except the horse. So the roads were terrible. And the first vehicles that went out of the city wasn't the Leon Ballet Voiturette, which had a very short history in WA, but they were de Dion tricycles. And they were like motorised push bikes, but with three wheels. And they were a disaster in the country because the third wheel would go down the rut in the middle of the road. So they were totally impractical. Very good in the city, but very impractical otherwise.
One of them made their way to Beverley, though, didn't they?
Yes, so that was the first Benz.
Yes.
And that came from the Channel Islands,
Okay.
would you believe? Willie Delisle brought it out. And that had been made by hand in using a Benz engine from Germany. And they just put this thing together and shipped it out here. He was a very wealthy guy. And when it arrived and the box was unloaded, the locals, let alone in Perth, you could imagine in Beverley, this was just incredible. This machine came out of a box with a big engine in it. Early 1900, that was the change. And over the next few years, of course, everything changed.
A car costs something like 10 years of wages for one person. So I'm assuming that the people that drove these cars were, maybe doctors or chemists.
Yeah, so the first car sold in Western Australia as a new car was sold by Claude Dean, and he sold it to a doctor. Other cars came in here. It was only the wealthy that would have cars, and they were only something to play with. They were just a novelty. There was no serious thing of these cars are going to take over the Western Australian landscape. Initially, they just came here. They're super expensive. The fuel was a problem. You didn't have any mechanics. The mechanics on cars didn't exist because there weren't any cars. So everything was difficult for the motoring pioneer.
Was there much resistance?
Well, there was in the city. There were very few cars in the country anyway, so it didn't matter. But in the city, the engine noise scared the horses, so the taxi drivers didn't like it. Pedestrians just heard a noise, but they didn't know that there was something going at 15 or 20 miles an hour, and they got run over. There was resistance at intersections where cars stopping at intersections and just going through, so people would get arrested. The police would time people in the city from intersection to intersection and then say that they'd broken the speed limit. They were regarded as pariahs, really, and because they were rich, there was always a suspicion of wealthy people not doing the right thing.
And everyone, I guess, was vying for space on the roads, weren't they, with horses, pedestrians, trams, you name it.
Yeah, you could just imagine. And then this noisy contraption with hardly any brakes going at a ridiculous speed, 10 miles an hour, faster than a horse, comes barreling past.
With anything new, there's always some sort of, a level of apprehension or hesitation about it. What were the biggest issues with this?
The biggest issues with the arrival of the car was really its utility compared with horses, the dangers of it. That was really the initial problem with the motorists, automobilists.
So which one was safer?
Well, if you had 100 cars going down St George's Terrace, I guess that'd be less safe. But horses had, there were enormous number of deaths through horse accidents with horses.
Every horse, they leave behind something like 15 tonnes or something, or 15 kilos of horse manure a day. So I guess in some respects it would be a healthier atmosphere to have the cars.
Yes, except the fumes. Everybody complained about the fumes from cars. There was no pollution control in those days.
So what needed to be fixed around Perth to accommodate the cars?
They needed laws. A traffic act actually didn't exist. And the Automobile Club of WA, which is today's RAC, that group of individuals actually pushed the government, because half of them were ministers of parliament anyway, members of parliament. They pushed for a uniform series of laws to actually control traffic on roads, even laws as to who stops at an intersection, what the maximum speeds could be. All of those sorts of things had to be controlled. And so they cooperated with the government and formed the first Traffic Act.
And what about driver's licences? When did they come in?
Driver's licences were interesting because they were local government, and you needed a driver's licence for a commercial vehicle. In those days, taxis, horse taxis had to be licensed. You had to have your cart licence, things like that. So driver's licences really began with professional drivers, chauffeurs, those sorts of people. But soon spread. Governments always like to introduce regulations.
It didn't really take off at first, though, didn't it? I think it was like 1908 that some still saw the car as a novelty and a nuisance.
Yeah, so up until 1905, 6, like that, I think in 1906 there were only 25 15 horsepower and greater cars in Western Australia, and there were only, say, I think it was 350 cars, something like that. Very small number of cars, and the population of Western Australia was only, 150,000 or something. The rate of car ownership was tiny. And if you see any old pictures of St George's Terrace or Hay Street, there are no cars on it because the cars were few and far between.
What do you think was the tipping point when people went, actually, these cars aren't so bad after all?
The revolution in cars was really brought about by Henry Ford. So in the 1900s, the French dominated the car building industry around the world. 80, 90% of the cars were French. And then Henry Ford wanted to build a car for the masses, and he was inspired as the son of a farmer to build a cheap car, went bust a few times, built a few cars, and then came up with the Model T concept, the famous Ford Model T. And that was in 1909. Now, before that, only the rich owned cars, and some commercial internal combustion engine vehicles were around. But Henry Ford, he didn't invent mass production, but he certainly used mass production to lower the cost of cars. So from then on, the car ownership and the use of cars on farms started to expand until you get really through to the 20s. For example, at the peak of Model T sales in Perth, the company Grave and Dwyer, who is the state dealer, they were selling 80 cars a month. Now, that's not bad considering there's a few 100,000 people lived here.
Yeah.
And the cost of the cars was coming down. They would deliver a car, they would put a car on a train and deliver it to a railway siding in the country. It would be taken off by the rail workers and left next to the road with fuel in it and instructions on how to drive it on the seat. And then the farmer would arrive and have to work it out, how to drive the Model T home.
That was their handover notes.
Yes, that's it.
Oh, so we also lost a whole industry of people, didn't we, through the rising of the cars, and obviously we've lost the stable hands, the farriers, the blacksmiths.
Yeah, they all went, but the smart ones became motor vehicle engineers. So if you were in the country and your car broke down, there was no mechanic to go to, so you'd go to the local blacksmith to fix it. So the blacksmiths were the predecessors of the motor mechanics really in country WA.
So when the cars took off in Perth or Western Australia, were they mainly electric or petrol? What was the fuel?
Fuels could be anything, any highly volatile hydrocarbon. Dry cleaning fluid, which we know today is hexane, and that fuel was used in the very first carburettors in these cars. So you'd go to your local chemist to buy that fuel. And if you're in the country, there weren't service stations, you'd get your fuel delivered to the chemist in the towns that you were going to, and then you'd pick it up when you arrived there.
That's quite odd, isn't it, really, that it's the chemist?
Yeah, it's the chemist. And you could put anything in it. They had naphtha, mothballs naphtha was an ingredient in the fuel in those days, and that lowered the volatility of the fuel, so it lasted longer. And then they had all the things like petrol, which they added, and everybody had their own idea of what fuel was the best.
Well, speaking of petrol, where was the first pump?
First petrol pump, actual pumped mechanical petrol pump, was in Fremantle at Shack's Motors. Up until probably the 1980s, it was still there, or the underground tank was still there, and it was when the building was renovated, it was pulled out and taken down the tip, which is a great tragedy. But that's what happened. Shack's Motors in Fremantle was one of the oldest original car dealers in WA. They celebrated their centenary.
And what happened after that? How did motorists fuel up?
Well, after that, you had the rise of the service station, so you could get service as well as fuel, and the mechanic would be there to keep your car going because cars broke down regularly. And then the service station would buy fuel from the different petrol companies or oil companies. So they would have maybe 6 or 12 different pumps at the front of their service station, and you had a preference for a particular type of fuel, you'd go and buy that from that particular pump, which is a contrast to today where all the fuels seem to be the same and there's one fuel in one manufacturer in each service station.
And we also had the old roster system, didn't we, back in the...
Yeah, so initially, the roster system's only relatively recently, really the 1950s onwards.
I think it wrapped up in 1996, but I don't know when it started.
Yeah. And it's the same as we have Sunday trading restrictions and things like that. It was exactly the same as the way the industry operated.
So in the second year of World War II, petrol rationing came into play. Can you just explain that to me?
Yeah, so Australia really didn't have a domestic oil industry to create its own fuel. It had to be brought in from Southeast Asia, obviously, Indonesia, British Petroleum, Shell, the Dutch company based in Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies. And so petrol was in short supply. It was required for the war effort. The last motor races in WA before the war happened just at the start of the war, and then petrol rationing came in, and motorsport in Western Australia ceased sort of in only a few months. So the whole community of motorsport ceased in WA. Farmers were issued with rationing tickets for fuel. All the essential industries could get fuel, but that began just like food, any other commodity in Australia, in Western Australia, there were ration tickets introduced. So people were very careful in the use of it.
How long did you have petrol rationing for?
Right up until after the end of World War II. So in 1944, when the war finished, everybody thought life would go back to normal very quickly, but it didn't. And the government was under enormous pressure to actually free up petrol rationing because people just wanted to get back to normal. But there wasn't really enough fuel to go around. And the government wanted to control the supply of fuel to private cars. So it was a very sensitive issue with the federal government about petrol rationing. And it eventually did get lifted, and it was like a joy. Suddenly people could just buy as much fuel as they wanted to, drive wherever they liked.
Yeah, there would have been a lot of upset people, that's for sure, if, they're picking and choosing who gets it and who doesn't get it.
You occasionally see people kept their ration books. They kept those last little ration tickets that they had to go to get in case petrol rationing came back. For years they kept the rationing tickets.
Yeah, right. It's like a collector's item now.
Yes.
And what about the road service? Can you explain the road service to me?
Yeah, so the road service by the RAC, if you go back to the early days of motoring, the driver of the car or the chauffeur, if they were very wealthy, the chauffeur would look after the car, make sure it ran. If you drove the car yourself, if the car broke down, you'd have to fix it yourself. So you had to be a jack of all trades, really, if you owned a car. In the 1920s, the RAC decided that a system of mechanics, troubleshooters, could be employed who could go and fix members' cars.
On mobile.
Yeah, the mobile
mechanics.
Mobile mechanics, and it was a huge member benefit because cars broke down so frequently, and you didn't want to get dirty with a car. If you can just imagine back in for example, a Ford Model T, it needs the oil changed every 500 miles, 800 kilometres. Everything needs to be greased in it. The car had very poor seals in the engine, so it leaked oil. The old saying is if a Model T didn't leak oil, then it was probably broken. So the cars were dirty, messy things.
Were they still serviced like cars are today?
They were serviced absolutely far more regularly than cars are today.
Because they had to.
Yeah.
Otherwise they wouldn't work. And
the other thing that happened in the 1920s was cars were always associated with ownership by males, but that wasn't really true. Cars have always been owned by females as well in Western Australia. The first curved dash Oldsmobiles, Mrs. Speed was the first person to get a driver's license. I think that's correct.
That couldn't be her real name.
That was her real name. She divorced her husband after that. She did eventually divorce him. But yeah, she was Speed. And she was one of these very, very go-ahead women who would do everything that the men did, no problem at all. And you could imagine, though, with the rise in female car ownership as well, that everybody wanted their car to go all the time. So the road patrol idea, the service guys to go out and help people keep their cars on the road without getting dirty, had universal appeal. And it was just a huge benefit for a member of the RAC to have that service.
So over the years, we've seen a lot of development in motor vehicles, and we've seen a lot of improvement and changes in different things. So let's just explore some of them, like the automatic transmissions, especially in smaller vehicles. What changes have we seen there?
If you go right back to the start, the vehicles only had one gear, so
that's easy.
So it didn't have to have a transmission change. The first cars had leather belts to drive, and you could change them easily. The Model T had a planetary transmission, so it only had 2 forward gears, and you just changed gears by effectively pulling on a handle or pushing a pedal down. So in a sense, it was like an automatic transmission. Then in the early 1930s, synchronizing mesh gearboxes were introduced, which means it was much easier to push the pedal down and then change the gear. And then they started electric changing of the gears. And it was only really after World War II that the modern idea of an automatic gearbox, which we know today, happened. So
it's relatively new then. Yeah.
It's relatively new, yeah. There used to be an old saying that the only thing that wasn't invented in cars before 1910 was electronics. And that's true, because you go through everything: overhead cams, magneto ignition, electric ignition, everything had been experimented with by about 1910. But yet only with the rise of the transistor did you start to get electronic ignition. And of course now cars run with everything electronic, don't they?
And what about fuel injection and traction control?
I don't know where traction control would have really actually started, because there's very poor traction on the early cars anyway, with the thin wheels and the poor brakes.
Yes, it must have been really bumpy.
And ABS and things like that. They're all as a result of the electronics and its ability to monitor things. So they're all relatively new. You'd get the early designers saying they had their own forms of traction control, I guess.
And then we get to ethanol and fuel.
Yes, well, as petrol comes out of the ground, it's refined. But from very early on in France, they started distilling fuel from grains. And so the very first fuel had ethanol in it. In Western Australia, they had a similar idea, and they saw that in winter the grass trees grow and they create the heart of it, which is a pulp, which is very high in sugars and things. And they would ferment that to create ethanol. And so there was a whole industry here for a while, and it was based just in Maylands, that area, where they were distilling the grass tree hearts to make fuel. Didn't last very long though. It was much cheaper to do it other ways.
That's a big industry.
It was a big industry for a very short time. They used to race across WA. The motorcycles used to race with ethanol distilled from grass trees. And it was a big deal. They thought it was going to take off, but the biggest problem with that is that grass trees don't grow quickly enough.
I was about to say that actually. They're quite slow. Yes. And aren't they protected? I'm not sure if they're protected.
I think in those days nobody really cared.
No, that's true. Well, fast forward to today, with electrification and increasing automation in cars, do you think there's similar resistance today from West Australians as there was back in the 1900s?
Well, the whole story of electric cars, I think, in Western Australia is interesting because Claude Dean probably brought in the first electric car into Western Australia in about 1903.
Right. So it's not new anyway.
It's not.
It's not new.
It's not new. The first electric motor vehicle was really an electric motorcycle that was brought in well before that, and with electric. The guy put an electric motor on it. The batteries didn't arrive, so he had a big cable running to the power. But the electric cars had a very early history here. If you look in New York, had half of its total vehicle fleet was electric in 1900. I think it was pretty much divided between petrol, steam, and electric cars in New York. That was made possible by Thomas Edison building power stations so you could charge the batteries. He got Henry Ford to work with him to create an electric Ford Model T because they thought, well, we're going to take over the world with, the Model T had taken over the world, the electric Model T could take over the world, a bit like Elon Musk thinks now. So they experimented with it for years. They didn't work in America and they didn't work here because the rise of car ownership with the middle class, they wanted to take their cars on weekends and drive out into the country, have a picnic and bring them back. It was a great status symbol to be able to do that because only the rich people could do that before. The electric car had difficulties. If you ran out of power, you're nowhere near a power station to charge
Totally
your
stuck.
batteries. You're stuck. So Henry Ford didn't progress with the electric car. It died in America. So from, say, 1900, when a third or a half of all the cars in America were electric, by 1920 there were only 5 electric car manufacturers left in America. And the electric car pretty much disappeared everywhere.
So we've pretty much done a full circle.
We have, yeah. And this sort of range anxiety that people talk about now was exactly the same as in 1900. The range anxiety killed the electric car there. So it'll be interesting to see over time whether the electric car can find its place in country WA because there's absolutely no question. I think that electric cars are good in the city for commuting where the predictable distances and times are involved. But in the country, it's still another question to be answered.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, really, isn't it? Especially with all the new brands coming in now. So people back then didn't trust cars because they didn't have any horses, and now we don't trust cars because they don't have any drivers. It seems like history is sort of just repeating itself.
Yes, and the dream of the driverless car has really been with the industry ever since it began. Everybody's wanted the driverless car. I guess GPS technology, satellites has enabled it, hasn't it?
So what are the biggest barriers to mass adoption of driverless cars?
I think the designers are grappling with they call it the kangaroo effect or something, where in Australia a kangaroo will jump randomly across a road, and for a driverless car to be safe, it has to predict the jump of a kangaroo across a road in headlights.
So you're putting a lot of faith in technology, aren't you?
And whether they will overcome that is the great question.
Yeah, what could they possibly do?
I think if you also look at the history of transport, that transport it starts in small ways. So you have driverless cars in very predictable locations, and then it expands and the technology improves. Like I was in Santa Monica recently in LA, and they have the robots that deliver coffees to the offices there, and so they go out of the coffee shop, cross the road, and deliver the coffee to the office block over the road. That's really, to me, that's the start, isn't it, of the revolution of the driverless car.
So based on history then, what lessons do you think we can apply to help smooth the transition to electric and driverless cars?
Well, I think electric cars are with us now anyway. I don't think there'll be a problem. The range will always be the issue. In terms of driverless cars, I think it's just that gradual transition to acceptability. So it'll be on very predictable routes, in city areas, and then these problems like the kangaroo hopping will have to be overcome overall.
So what do you think transportation in WA will look like in 50 years, just with your, your
Wow.
extensive knowledge on, the whole history of motoring in Western Australia? What do you think it's going to look like?
Well, you can virtually guarantee that Perth will be ridiculously larger than it is now, won't it?
Yeah.
So the rate that freeways are built here, there'll be freeways connecting everything. The big question is, will there be driverless cars on those freeways, and will we all have personal car ownership?
That's the thing. Do you think that drivers will be behind the wheel or not in 50
Well,
years?
I mean, the dream of the driverless car industry is that there'll be half a dozen cars in an office block, and they're all driverless, and people will go down the lift, jump into the driverless car, which will take them to work, and then it'll be used by somebody else to go somewhere else.
It's interesting, yes. What do your contemporaries say about that?
I'm probably the age of the person that's in love with the whole idea of cars and the noisy, smelly, revving objects that you can play with and fix and can become sort of an extension of yourself. I'm in that generation, I guess. Child of the 60s.
But do you think the reaction to automation and driverless cars is similar to when cars first arrived?
No, I think it's quite different now because we have so many transportation options. I see young people now, and I guess the RAC's probably experienced that as well. The take-up of young people for cars isn't like it used to be. I've got a few cars of my own, too many. But my son, for example, hasn't got a driver's license. My daughter has. He sees no need. He's a software engineer in computing. He's got an electric bicycle, an electric-powered bicycle. He takes Ubers. He gets around.
Well, that's the other thing, isn't it? I think more and more people are adopting the scooters and the bikes.
Yeah, the whole society is changing.
So what forces are now causing shifts in the design of machine that has remained largely unchanged for over a century?
Every major innovation, they say, in cars was driven by manufacturers' costs, not necessarily by anything else. So every manufacturer wanted to make something of a similar quality but more cheaply. And then governments have imposed things like fuel economy and that sort of element. So there's a lot of things at play with what cars look like now. Every manufacturer wants to make the cheapest car. That's a problem Elon Musk has with his Tesla because the Chinese are putting cheaper cars. Maybe they're not so good, maybe, I don't know, but they're cheaper. And so he's got competition from that. So the manufacturers have to respond. He'll have to respond to that and make a cheaper car. You saw the American car dominated the Western Australian car market. 80% of the cars were Model Ts, another 10% were American, and the other 10% was everybody else because they were the most durable cars and the cheapest. The French cars were really expensive. English cars weren't so durable. You've seen that whole competitive situation with the rise of the Japanese cars and then Korean cars and now Chinese cars. It's the same process is just underway, as it will always be, I guess.
It used to be Ford and Holden back in my day, and
Yes.
now it's moved on.
Yeah, well, there's Chinese brands that you've never heard of, but in 10 years' time, everybody will talk about the attributes of those brands like they talk about, Toyotas now.
So to wrap up, if we just look at the 1910 motorist, how does that compare to today's?
Well, one of my favourite stories is what was it like in 1910 between Perth and Kalgoorlie, and just take yourself back to that time. Everybody went to Kalgoorlie by the railway, the passenger train to Kalgoorlie, pretty much everybody went on it. The motorist set off from Perth. It would maybe be a 2 or 3 day trip to Kalgoorlie in those days by motor car. You had to make sure the fuel was there. The fuel had been shipped to each of the towns on the way for you to fill up. Great Eastern Highway that we know today was more like, if you could imagine, 7-lane wide Lanceland sand track where everybody had to find their own way across this enormous, wide, rutted, sandy trek all the way pretty much from the Darling Range to Kalgoorlie. And you'd eventually get there, and there's this fantastic land of, the Kalgoorlie, the Nirvana, the gold town of Kalgoorlie. Compare that to today. Maybe it took 2 or 3 days to get to Kalgoorlie in those days. You'd sleep in your car if you had to, if you didn't make it to the next town. Nowadays, what is it? 6-8 hours to Kalgoorlie. You can drive an electric car to Kalgoorlie. As long as there's enough the charging station's okay halfway, you'll get there. You're sitting in this comfortable lounge. You've got the radio on, all of that sort of stuff. We've come a long way in Western Australia with the car.
Well, thanks so much for your time today, Graeme. You're a wealth of knowledge, and I look forward to chatting again soon.
Yes, and if people want to see more about early cars and the history of motoring, there's the WA Motor Museum at Whiteman Park and the York Motor Museum, both excellent museums. Take the kids there and show them what the history of motoring is. They'd be fascinated, I'm sure.
Fabulous, thank you. And thank you for tuning in. If you like this episode, let us know and share it with a friend. Don't forget to hit subscribe, and we'll catch you in the next episode of RAC's Horizons podcast.